for those that just joined, if you have questions, just plug them into the chat, and then we can use that to kind of get to other stuff as we finish this. My goal is to keep the learning to about 20-30 minutes. We'll see if that happens so we can have the back half to work through stuff and talk about anything you guys are dealing with. So this is basically about how to hire right for biz dev and graduate out of owner-led sales, or if you do already have a salesperson, how to kind of get the best performance from them and so on. A lot of you know us at this point and know me, so some of this might be a reminder. But I'm Dan from Sales Schema. My background originally is in the agency space, first working on the account side back when you could say, hey, we do social media and companies would give you all their money. I then worked for Will, who's on this call right now, selling animated video services, and learned a lot from that. Because Will's here, I'll actually give him some props. He implemented a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about really well and built a lot of these systems before hiring a salesperson. And he's one of the very few agency owners that did that at an early stage. So I was able to be successful in that role partially because of me being great, but not so much that, also because Will set things up really well. So I'll get into that more. From there, anyway, started Sales Schema in 2014. Since then, we've worked with like 110 agencies, talked to a lot more than that. And right now, what we do is we help agencies implement the right outreach system that's tasteful and targeted so that they then can support salespeople and achieve bigger and better things. The obligatory personal stuff, so you know that I'm not a Russian deepfake. Live in New York, have a 9-month-old that keeps me busy. Luis Rodriguez is also a key part of our team and has helped us kind of like implement a lot of the strategy along with Michelle, who's our ops manager on this call. We have a weird sort of like MMA/fight theme that runs through the company because I'm really into jiu-jitsu and Luis is into boxing, and those metaphors end up into the business in lots of goofy and overwrought ways. So that's us. There's Michael joining. So with that, I think that if you're here and you're like a lot of our clients, there's what I've seen is that through the years, there's kind of like three aspirational goals that people are going for, or really like seasons. I think the first is growth, looking to grow revenues or headcount or take over your space, take over the world. The second is security and lifestyle, which could involve getting out from under the weight of a gorilla client. It could involve getting out from under the weight of a gorilla partner, choosing your clients instead of the other way around, going home on time, opening up more freedom. I would say the early years of the business, it was more door one, and now it's way more door two because the culture's changed for lots of reasons. And then the third aspiration, I think, is transition, which is could be getting ready for an acquisition, which is something that I'm talking about, or maybe selling to employees or optimizing the deliverable, optimizing who you serve. All these things kind of go under transition. And with that in mind, there's one key metric that is kind of like a lead domino, where if you take that and you can run with it, it brings everything else along with it. And that's increasing enterprise value. Even if you have no plans to sell, this is sort of thinking about what it would take to get a high multiple and to create a business that somebody else would want to buy. It's just a great way to build a great business. And there's people that know way more about buying and selling agencies than us. We've interviewed people like David Tobin, who runs Tobin Leff, and others that have gone through acquisitions. And one of the biggest things that can either make it easy to sell or hard to sell is getting owners out of the sales seat, right? And building the systems for that. So that's really, what a lot of this is about. And with that, I think in that effort, there's a few common traps we see people fall into. And I think just labeling them can be helpful so that you can know them when they're coming, or if you've already made them, avoid them going forward. I think we've made at least two of these. So it's not like we're perfect either. But we call them the siren song mistakes because they usually happen in sort of this enticing way because the agency does really well and you have all this money. So you're like, great, let me go invest in people at the wrong time, or the agencies, or you're stressed about sales and you've gotten off bad calls. You just don't want to do it anymore. So these can be kind of like siren songs. The first is the superhuman owner. Now, as I'll talk about, at the early stage of or not even the early stage, even for years, the owner is going to have some amount of selling while handling other things like ops and bouncing back and forth between clients and so on. The superhuman owner is when the owner or the ownership sets these goals, but they don't make any change in terms of getting support or opening up time and resources to support that owner who is in sales. So it's kind of this like wishful thinking of, hey, we're going to go run all these funnels and do all these things while without making any sort of supporting scaffolding for that owner. And then it usually just ends up in burnout and all that bad stuff. So that's one thing to avoid. Another, which Rusty, I think you kind of hinted at the beginning, is the lonely islands, where this usually happens when there's multiple partners in an agency, and there's a situation that is built on a referral or reactive situation where it's like, hey, when we get a CPG lead, it's going to go to Lisa because she used to work at Frito-Lay, and when we get a tech lead, it's going to go to Bob because he used to work at, some big tech company. So however that pans out, the issue with that is sales becomes this downtime, part-time hobby, and it never gets the attention or the bandwidth that it deserves. So we're gonna talk about how to avoid that in a second. The next, which is really common, this is one we've made, is that premature sales hire. The reason there's a driver icon here is because it's a little bit like hiring a driver before you have the car, right? And it can be, very easy to make this mistake in a lot of different ways. So we'll talk about how to avoid that in a second. And the fourth is the conscript. We've seen this happen in situations where there's a need for a salesperson, and there's somebody that understands the service and the market really well and seems excited to do it even, but they haven't fully wrapped their head around what the role entails. They might not be incentivized, the systems aren't in place to support them, and then it often doesn't work because the ownership doesn't know what standard to put this person on, and the person in that role may or may not actually want to be in a sales role. So those are the things to avoid. I think with that, there's a real order of operations we've seen generally work well for graduating out of owner-led sales and scaling. I think the issue is to sum it all up, there's the idea of starting with the when, like when am I going to hire and what needs to be in place first, then going to the who. There's a great book called Who that makes this argument really well. You start with the people, then think about the what, then get to the what, and then get to the how. So for today, we're going to be focusing probably 80-90% on the when and the who. And that takes talking about the stages of growth and the stages of agency sales sophistication. So to go through that, the first stage that we tend to see is one that we've started to call the glorified freelancer, right? This is where you're kind of doing everything as an owner. You're bouncing back and forth between clients and trying to sell when you have time, and really trying to develop a track record. So in this situation, there's one of two things that could happen. There's nothing wrong with being a freelancer if that's what the agency owner decides that they want. That could be great, just as long as they know what that means and know that they're not necessarily building an enterprise. But if assuming, the person wants to get out of this stage, or the organization does, the who at this stage is really the owner, combined with investing in getting fulfillment off of his or her plate so that more time can be put towards sales. It's not necessarily giant investments in sales and marketing or in buying ads or whatever. It's really like getting as much bandwidth to focus on sales to get to the next stage. Next stage, I think, will look pretty familiar to a lot of agencies. It probably accounts for more than 80% of the clients we've worked with historically at Sales Schema. The other thing to mention here is that these stages are not necessarily pegged to revenue or headcount. We've worked with 8-figure agencies that would fall into this category, as well as 7 or even 6-figure. And that's the cobbler's children. This is a situation where the agency has been around for at least a few years, sometimes even decades. They have a strong track record. They might have a few verticals that they serve really well, a lot of different services, but all the business is mostly 80-90% or more from referrals and the ownership, the owner's personal networks and that sort of thing, which makes it really hard to scale and support a salesperson and so on. So at this stage, this is where we tend to see those mistakes happen. That's where we tend to see the premature hires and the sales islands and all these other issues. So at this stage, what we've seen work really well, what we usually recommend, is the owner still continuing to own the process, and at this point to progress to devoting most of their time to sales. Maybe that's at least 50% and upwards at the cobbler's children phase, and then also enlisting support, and that can mean different things, and I'll get into that in a second. So first, let's talk about the sales lead and what they're doing. So this is going to be an owner. This is probably premature to hire a salesperson. Things they could be doing, obviously talking to prospects, selling complex services to skeptical buyers is tough for an outsider to do before you've built that process and built that scaffolding. Developing the ICPs or the ideal client profiles, figuring out who we're serving. That's something that is a pretty entrepreneurial task and is going to go through months or longer of trial and error to really figure that out. And it's not like you can just say, hey, salesperson, here's like five different areas we're good at. You figure it out, right? That's going to take an owner. Another thing is, crafting email copy. This is more in our world of outbound and figuring out like what are we saying to these people and how to de-risk those calls and how to put our best foot forward. And then obviously like proposals and closing deals. Although others can start to support some of those efforts. So with that in mind, let's talk about one question that comes up a lot in a multi-partner situation is who should do this? Like you have a bunch of people that could do it. How do you figure that out? And I think what one mistake we see is figuring out like, well, who has the biggest Rolodex, who has the most expertise in a given vertical. That stuff can matter. It's not like it's meaningless, but the main considerations we usually recommend looking at are going to be who has the most ownership over the process as well as motivation to do it. That's really important. Who has the bandwidth for it, or if nobody has the bandwidth, who is willing to make the bandwidth to support sales and spend at least half their week on it, ideally. Who can offer value to a prospect on a call? I mean, all owners should be able to, but there's the idea, in a complex sale, it's not just about, identifying just buyers, it's also being able to teach and being able to move things forward that way. So if there's an owner that is better able to do that than another, that's a consideration. And then the last thing is incentivized, generally everyone should be, but there could be a situation where somebody might not have the same stake or the same incentives to lead the process. So those are the things we like to recommend looking at. As far as the support role, who could this be? And I think the good news is there's not one right way to do this. When we're training sales teams, or not sales teams that are usually one person, so that's kind of a quote unquote sort of deal. When we're working with agencies to implement outbound, we've had a number of different ways this can work well. I think the who can be a client service person that's already working with clients, but that can shave off a number of hours to helping with sales when they can. A trusted freelancer. I think one objection we see to this is like, hey, we're going to have to pay out of pocket to get this person to help us. And our response is usually, well, yeah, it's going to take investing in sales and marketing at some point. And if you have a freelancer that works really well, you're probably going to get more leverage out of them than lots of other things you could be doing. So it's going to take doing that at some point. Or it could be that junior level sales hire. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that right away. But if you're already doing that or you already have somebody that could be a great option, they can be slotting into that support role to help an owner build that scaffolding and build those systems to support a salesperson later. The what or task examples can really run the gamut, but in our world, this is often research and list building, which is something that gets slotted into kind of grunt work, but it's really not. If you're working on your ICPs and deciding where your strike zone is, the process of deciding, okay, this fintech company is a great fit and this other one is not, is something that it becomes a higher level role, right? And that in terms of like outreach success, that's really informed by the quality of that list that you're building. So that's one example. Another is scheduling. We've seen clients have great success with this, having somebody in like a PA capacity to handle that back and forth, CRM maintenance, making sure the data is clean and updated the right way, as well as accountability. Simply having that sales support role means there's somebody else that's involved, which means there's somebody else to tell you, hey, by the way, what's the deal with this person you talked to 90 days ago? Can we follow up with them and so on? So those are all some examples. From there, getting into that next phase, we see this as the transitional agency. This is a situation where the agency has generally gotten traction with at least one channel. It could be outbound or it could be inbound, but they're starting to see leads outside of just the finite networks of the owners. I think at this stage, the other thing that's happening is metrics are being developed so that hey, our close rate is this, our sales cycle is that. If I talk to X number of people, I can expect Y closes over this amount of time. So that data is starting to be developed, and that institutional knowledge is the sort of thing that goes towards supporting a salesperson. I think one of two things can happen at this transitional stage. One thing, like the goal is to get to the next stage, which I'll talk about in a second, where there's a lot more reliability. The other thing that can happen is that owners kind of get ensnared back into client fires and other stuff, and they get pulled out of proactively growing the agency, and then they end up back at stage two, which is the thing that we obviously want to avoid. So at the transitional stage, what does the who look like? Like what can that sales team look like? The first is the owner still needs to be heavily involved in the process, but if certain boxes are checked, which I'll talk about, this is where the agency might decide to start um, having a salesperson involved, and they might start hiring that salesperson, as well as continuing that sales support and all the systems that have been developed already, and kind of continuing on with those to keep them going. So, I think one big question is, when do you know that you're ready to hire a salesperson? We've gotten this wrong. We've seen tons of agencies get it wrong over the years. And I think there's a few boxes to check. I think it's a little bit like surfing. If you've ever gone surfing, I've done it a handful of times. The usual mistake people make is they stop paddling too soon before the wave has lifted them up and they can kind of surf to the shore. It's usually not because you over paddle, it's because you under paddle. So with that, you want there to be enough historic data so that you know, again, things like your close rates, you have a standard on which to compare a sales hire that you have made. So that helps a lot. And even if it's not perfect, and even if you're expecting them to close at a lower rate, you need some kind of benchmark there. Another thing is lead flow, and this is probably the hardest boss of the video game. But it takes not just getting the lead flow you would need to hit whatever financial goals you set, but probably getting a lot more than that. Napkin math, probably at least 50% more than those leads for a couple of reasons. For one, that salesperson, even if they're amazing, they're going to close at a lower rate than a partner probably would for the first 6, 12 months. And also, you probably don't want to give them all of your leads right away because that can be very risky, right? So you want to be able to reserve enough for yourself while giving them enough to, frankly, screw up and then eventually do better with. So that's the second checkbox. The third is also something to really think about. It's bigger than the scope of this presentation, but that's developing a consistent deliverable. If you have five different verticals and six different services, it's really tough to say to a salesperson, here's what the script should look like. Here is our process. They're going to be juggling a million different things. And I think as part of that, a mistake that we see a lot of agencies make is expecting that salesperson to figure out how to do that. Great salespeople can be entrepreneurial. They can pick up phones, they can run with stuff, but they're not going to develop that system all by themselves. They're going to need a lot of support and a lot of help to do that. So consistent deliverable is the third one. And the fourth one that is based on all the above is training and accountability. I think being able to budget time at least weekly to doing things like role plays, to going through watching tape, frankly, looking at calls and all that sort of thing is going to be really important, versus just sending people out on an ice float and expecting them to be successful. What's funny is in a lot of agencies, there's very buttoned up training and support for fulfillment roles, but because there's this blind spot with sales, there's this sort of like, well, I'm just going to hire somebody and they're going to run with everything and be successful, which doesn't usually work. So finally, what is that fourth stage? What does that look like? When we see agencies that have done this, it usually looks like systems and scale. We call it the enterprise, back to the beginning of this. And what that tends to mean is having at least one inbound channel that works as well as one outbound channel, which we believe to be very important because then you're not relying on people knocking on your door. You can actually go and knock on doors and generate business without having to go through the auspices of a tech company or ads or anything like that, which is something I can get into later. So getting those things working at this point, the owner is involved exactly where, when, and how they want to be. If they want to stay involved, that's great. But often that means another salesperson owning the process. They're supported by other people as well as systems at this stage. So that's what the team looks like. Got another, probably 5 minutes or so, then we can bring this to the workshop. I think the next part of this is basically like, so you're ready to hire a salesperson. Maybe you're in this phase, these phases, like the transitional or that enterprise stage. And I think what we tend to see is is certain things being overvalued in that hiring process when we've seen agencies run through this before. And that's not to say these things don't matter at all. They do, but they're just overvalued. And I think the first one is Rolodex. We see a lot of, hey, I got in touch with this person. They have an amazing Rolodex. They know all these people in whatever niche we're in, and so on. So that can be helpful, but oftentimes, the Rolodex doesn't pan out at all because there just isn't great product market fit between the people that they know and the people the agency serves. There is, but then that Rolodex is expended, and that person may or may not have the skills or the temperament to get to the next phase, right? So either way, the Rolodex is going to be finite, which is back to the issue that owners have as well. So that's the first thing that's overvalued. The second is industry experience. This can definitely help shortcut the training process. So it doesn't mean that it's not helpful at all, but it's sometimes overvalued because if you get somebody that's intelligent and has the capabilities, you're going to be able to teach them almost anything, right? So there's other things that are more important. And then the third is interview performance. Another thing that matters, if you get bad interview performance, that's probably a red flag. But a lot of the times it can be overvalued because great salespeople are, guess what, really good at selling themselves in interviews. And it's often not enough alone. So, what are better things to focus on? And we've been through this a lot. We've probably hired, I don't know, what do you think, Michelle? Almost 10 salespeople over the course of time. Some have worked, some really haven't. And what we've seen to be predictive from our own experience as well as other agencies and just looking at hiring best practices in other industries as well. I think what's undervalued, number one, or there's an animation glitch there, so both popped up. The first is past performance, sort of unsurprisingly. I think that what the sort of questions that we like to ask in the sales process are like, in your previous position, how many other salespeople were you stacked up against? What was your performance compared to theirs? If they were in another agency and they didn't have a massive sales team, you can still get at this. What did revenues look like, before you got there? How did they look after you got there? This is going to tie back to another one that I'll talk about in a second. But when we talk to references, what will they say about your performance compared to others? And good salespeople will generally be able to give you something to hang your hat on. They'll be able to talk about the metrics, the numbers on some level, as opposed to just vagaries. So that's important. The second one here is motivations, right? And I think this can mean different things. And it's not necessarily a deal breaker if somebody doesn't want to be in a sales role forever. But what we've tended to run into are situations where people are using a sales job as a fallback and they don't really want to be doing it. And they really want to be doing client service or ops or something else. And when you get into that and you're asking questions like, hey, in a couple years, like ideally, what would you like to be doing? What are the things that motivate you? What's the work you enjoy? Often you'll get answers of like, I like working with clients. I like solving, problems on the operational front. I like managing projects. These are all signs that somebody doesn't really want to be doing sales. It's funny because if there's ways it can go the other way, but sales is such a demanding role and it involves a lot of rejection and a lot of ups and downs that if somebody isn't 100% motivated to do it, it often doesn't work. So this is something that we really like to check for and really get people to sell us on why they want to be in sales. I think the next one, and I wish there was a nicer way to put it, but is frankly intelligence. Can they deal with complexity? If you're talking about a complex marketing project for a large enterprise, they're going to have to think on their feet and wrap their head around lots of things pretty quickly, and this is something to keep an eye on. I think tied to this is preparedness. Did they come with questions about your organizations, and are they, do they have at least some understanding of what you do, even if it's not perfect, even if there's going to be a lot more learning from them for them to do. And then the fifth one is references. This is one where sometimes I'll get the objection of, hey, if somebody provides a reference, it's probably going to check out. And I think this is missing the value of what a reference is, because a reference is going to give you non-public information that can be really valuable. So there's a couple things that work. For one, you can go outside of provided references, but even if you don't do that, the references are going to be able to sort of whisper at what this person's actually about. And and basically how successful they can be in your organization. They're going to be able to talk about past performance in a way that you would never be able to get from them on a call. Um, and also tied to this is the sort of thing that they're subtly whispering to you. Like what I'm going for on a reference call is somebody sort of like taking me by the shoulders and saying, "Hey, dummy, go hire this person before somebody else does." And that can be really valuable. I think in situations where we haven't had a sales hire work out, hindsight 2020, when I look back at the references, they were often things like colleagues as opposed to direct managers. So that's the sort of thing that can be really telling. And the sixth, and I think the most important quality that we look for in good salespeople is curiosity, right? Because this is something that's very hard to teach, and I think it matters more with a complex service because there's just such a deep, webbing of problems and complexity in the situation that you really need somebody that's going to ask questions that you might not have thought of as part of that sales process to understand the underlying pain of an organization that is making decisions. So those are a few things that we found to work really well. With that, to open up time for the workshop pretty soon. In summary, if I had to sum it up, it's basically the bad news is what we've found is that you really need to build the car before hiring a driver. The good news is others can help you build it. So that's the summary. With that, let's get to questions, which I haven't been able to see yet. So cool. So